7 myths British people believe about Americans. Let's see how many apply to me. This is from the Lost in the Pond channel. I'm really excited about it. And without further ado, let's launch the video.
Hello, this video is sponsored by BritBox, the premier streaming service for Britain's most beloved TV shows. I'm Lawrence Brown and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to myths. Specifically, myths that British people, including myself at one point, believed about the United States of America.
Let's go.
But it is amazing what 14 years of living in the United States will do to your understanding and your perceptions about this very country.
Did it get worse? that would be the best answer. You live in America for 14 years and you know less about the country when you arrived. To spend the entire time sitting in your garage, drinking tea and listening to BBC Radio.
For instance, I learned early on that they don't have Cornish pasties.
Barbarism.
I learned slightly less earlier on, so later, that Michigan has them. But I don't live in Michigan, so one way or another
If you've never had a Cornish pasty, I was born in Cornwall, my honest answer is don't. Well, my honest advice. They are an acquired taste, and they're not a taste that I've yet acquired. So, yeah.
Still have to have them imported. A quick reminder that if you're not subscribed to this channel, you can change that fact about your life right now.
Subscribe to me and to him.
They're way beyond the absence of quintessentially British food. And so now that I've lived here for about a seventh of a century, it's time to outline some of the myths that us British believe about America and Americans. This is a funny one, because I think television gives us this notion that Americans do all live in giant houses like the McAllisters do in Home Alone. But it's not entirely the case. Sure, I mean, statistically, American houses are on average larger than their UK counterparts. There are a number of reasons for this, which I outlined in this video.
So I think this is a good point. When I think of like American dwellings, and this is mainly drawn from movies and TV, I tend to either think of kind of suburbia, so sort of large detached houses, or I think of kind of blocks of flats in the cities. But clearly there must be a lot of stuff in between, which I'm just seeing less of. So that's kind of the perception I'm getting from film and TV. So I think this is a really good point. Obviously you guys do have bigger houses on average than us, because you have the advantage of a lot more land. I mean, the UK is pretty densely populated, and it's pretty hard to get planning permission.
But to say that all Americans live in really large houses is a complete fabrication of anything resembling the truth. And I was a good example of this before I became a YouTube sensation, because when I first moved to Chicago, we had to do things...
Everything changes when you become a YouTube sensation. Just trust me on that one.
...things on a budget. Between me and my wife, we weren't making a great income, and this is a major city, so we had to sort of settle for an apartment whose dimensions were 300 square feet. And for those of you who don't know, that's about the size of a shoebox, roughly.
Yeah.
You know, we had to leave our shoes outside the door. That's how small it was. And it is worth reiterating, I think, that the cost of living in the United States does fluctuate massively across the country. When I lived in Indiana, just one state over, we were paying about $530 a month. That's basically unheard of.
So this is something I've heard. I've heard for like New York, especially New York City, obviously, but New York State and California, it's really expensive. The other parts are a lot cheaper. I've heard that Texas is very good value, considering it's got a really strong, kind of vibrant economy. I don't know if that's true. Let me, guys, please do let me know if I'm wrong, but that's kind of what I picked up.
Chicago. And it's certainly unheard of in New York City, which of course was the city in which the show Friends is set. And I think it shows like that that gave us this impression that Americans were all living in big apartments. And speaking of houses, I was alerted to a tweet recently from a British person who couldn't believe that American addresses go way up into the thousands, and their belief on this was that every street in the United States has thousands of houses on it. And this was a belief that I used to have, because the country is absolutely massive, so you almost expect it to have to house that many people. But the thing is, there are way fewer people in this country per square mile than there are in Britain, so it doesn't add up. And that's when I got looking into it. And in a previous video, I outlined it doesn't really work like that. On any given street, they don't start at the number 1 and then end at 10,000.
Okay.
Often, and it's the case here in Chicago, you'll usually have a string of houses, for example, all in the 6,000s on a given street. And that's because it's about 6 miles from the centre of downtown. 1 mile in from that, they're all 5,000s. Another mile, they're all 4,000s, etc., etc.
So that is interesting. I had no idea about that. I generally, I really like, I haven't been to that many American cities, but the ones I've been to, I really like the grid design because it's so easy to find stuff. So like New York or Washington, DC, like you go up to like 15th Avenue or 12th Avenue, whatever. It's really logical. Whereas like British cities look like someone's grabbed sort of a bowl of spaghetti and just dumped it on the ground, and that's basically how our kind of layout works, which is more quaint, but it can be really, really hard to find stuff if, like me, you've got no real sense of direction. So that's one area where Americans are doing really well.
Now, not every city in the US does it from the centre of the city. It could be from another part of the city or just some other central point.
Okay,
that's the general rule for how the numbering works on US houses. This one comes up again and again, that the United States is such a young country that it basically doesn't have a history. And I've always thought of this perception of America to be quite a lazy one. Because even if you go back to 1776 through to the present day, yes, it is a short amount of time in comparison to the history of Britain, but think about all of the insane things that happened in that period. And even if you ignore all that, there's one thing that we tend to forget because we don't get taught it very deeply in Britain, and that is the thousands of years of native history that happened before we even turned up. I was absolutely blown away, not literally, that would be weird. When I went to Cahokia Mounds here in Illinois, many, many hundreds of years ago, Cahokia Mounds used to be a native city, and it had about 20,000 people, which might not sound like a lot by both American and British standards, but back in the day, that was more than London. I once read about this volcano.
I'd literally never heard of that place. It sounds amazing. Like I mean, because as he says, in that time period, a city of 20,000 people was enormous. Yeah, I genuinely never, and I'm slightly embarrassed because I did history at university, so I probably should have done. But as to his wider point, like obviously people talk about America being a young country, and I think it still is a fairly young country. But I think it's fair to say America is probably out of adolescence now, kind of in terms of how all countries are. I mean, so for example, some European countries, so Germany and Italy, were only unified in their current form in the mid 1800s. There are lots of countries that only appeared in the 20th century, but kind of the end of colonialism. So whilst America is admittedly still quite young compared to some Asian and some European countries, I think it's not as kind of young as it used to be. I think is a good way of putting it. Like it's growing up. It's got itself a car. It's learnt to drive. It's got itself a girlfriend. It's all going well.
Volcano eruption that happened in present-day Oregon a few thousand years ago, and this eruption was witnessed and recorded by Native Americans who were in the area at the time. And long story short, they basically saw the origins of Crater Lake, which is absolutely huge. To be honest, both Brits and Americans love their myths. I mean, we've got the Loch Ness Monster, you've got a cryogenically frozen Walt Disney, and this mystery on BritBox, Sherwood has got
modern-day Robin Hood.
Can we not do that?
Oh.
Start giving nicknames to wanted murderers and the press gets excited.
And I know
who's like the biggest American folk hero, do you think? I don't know why I'm just kind of thinking aloud because of the whole Robin Hood thing. Bonnie and Clyde, maybe? I mean, obviously they've got the advantage of actually being real people. I don't know. Let me know below who you think America's biggest folk hero is. Obviously, this is now an advert, I believe, for BritBox, so I will talk over it. I'm trying to cut down the length of my intros, which is why this one was like 20 seconds, not my usual crap where I tell you about how my rabbit's doing and why I haven't bought a rabbit, why I don't own a rabbit, why I probably should own a rabbit, what rabbits taste like. Cut all that, and I'm getting straight to the point. So we'll see how it goes. I might go back to the old way.
Please head to BritBox.com/LostInThePond and use the promo code LostInThePond when signing up for a monthly subscription, and you'll get 50% off your first month.
And also use the promo code BritishGuys and it will make absolutely no difference.
The link is also in my description below.
Very nice.
This one is embarrassing for me because years ago I believed that Canada and the United States were basically the same country. And the reason that I believe that is, number one, I was 12, so cut me some slack. And number two, my only sort of exposure to both countries was through the people, was through the way they spoke. And to my young ears, which couldn't yet differentiate these two accents, Macho Man Randy Savage and Bret Hart basically had the same accent, just with an entirely different timbre. And that's all I had to go on. And I think it's what a lot of British...
So I honestly still can't tell the difference between American and Canadian. Well, I mean, I can tell like a difference between like a Texan accent and a Canadian accent, but I can't tell the difference between someone from New York and someone from Toronto, for example. I'm constantly being surprised that celebrities turn out to be Canadian when I just assume they're American. Ryan Reynolds, for example, I only found out he was a Canadian a few months ago, and I don't want to say it destroyed my moral universe, but I do now question everything I used to believe. I mean, more generally, I kind of think that the way in Britain we think of Canada is almost like America Light, which is basically what this guy is saying. So if America is sort of like Coca-Cola, Canada is like Diet Coke, essentially. It's kind of America, but with slightly more European, a little bit softer. Again, this may be a completely unfair perception. I mean, I've never been to Canada, but that is kind of how it's seen. I mean, obviously a lot of kind of Canadians act in American stuff, but I think there's less big media set in Canada itself, sort of less films and TV set around Canada itself. Most it seems to be Canadian actors in American productions.
British people have to go on, because I still occasionally see those comments. Oh, what is the difference between Canada and America? Or is it essentially that one has Mounties and the other doesn't? And it's only since I moved here that I've become super aware of the substantial difference between the two countries. Okay. Completely different healthcare systems, completely different food, completely different use of English. Right, in Britain we call it the loo, in America they call it a restroom, in Canada they call it a washroom. And really? I've seen all manner of different examples.
Because I would have thought a washroom is somewhere you like go to wash your clothes, and I'm glad this guy mentioned that, because this could have saved me from an embarrassing mishap in New Brunswick in 10 years' time.
Examples of that.
Because that is not where you want to go to the toilet.
Kind of thing. In America, they don't celebrate Boxing Day. In Canada, they do. The Canadian dollar is different to the American dollar. In some ways, they go with British English in places that America doesn't. And now that I'm older and I've listened to some of the regionalisms throughout the United States, even the way Americans speak is different to how Canadians speak. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But these differences certainly go way beyond how the two countries pronounce the word about, above. I've touched on this before, but I couldn't really do a video without including it in this list. This perception that Americans are loud and boisterous. And I can understand on some level where that comes from, because I think the way Americans speak, it comes from a different part of the throat. So it's a bit more projected, right? Whereas us Brits, it's more sort of, I don't know, understated a lot of the time. I think another reason that we think Americans are loud is how they present themselves in films. There might even have been a time in my life where I thought all Americans were loud just because Jim Carrey was. He's Canadian, isn't he? He is Canadian. And culturally
speaking... To be honest, like, the Americans I've met in real life, I know it's a stereotype, but Americans I met quite a few at university, American tourists I've seen about. I just haven't found that stereotype to be true at all, really. I mean, honestly, I think British people abroad can be quite loud. So, yeah, that's just not something I personally noticed.
I definitely have found that Americans speak at a higher volume when they're in restaurants together, but there are so many other examples of the opposite being true. On match day, after we've had a pint or six, you know, we're singing the songs of our team who we love because they happen to be situated in the town that we were born in. And it's just what we do when we leave a nightclub, which, you know, I haven't done in 20 years, but when we did, you know, I'd be on the street yelling at traffic cones, because that might have just been me.
That is a fairly essential part of British culture, yelling at traffic cones. I think I'm not sure we'd have held together as a nation without that to unite us.
But what I'm saying is, when we get drunk, we very much give Americans a run for their money. There's a loud person in all of us, right? And once we free ourselves of our inhibitions, we can let out all of the decibels we want. That's not a call to action. It's merely an observation.
So basically, Americans are more free because you don't have to be so reserved. I love that idea. I'm going to try and free myself from my inhibitions more and just shout at people. Americans are
This is only funny, not because of the image of Americans walking around with bomb bags on, but it's because we call them bomb bags and you call them fanny packs, and it's bloody hilarious.
So, as you may or may not know, fanny means something slightly different in the UK. I don't know how to put this politely. It's to do with a lady's special parts is perhaps as close as I can get.
It is also partly the visual, because bomb bags have never been cool, but this notion, which I occasionally read, that Americans are just always walking around wearing one, is very laughable, especially as somebody who's lived here 14 years. So it's quite dumbfounding, this one. I'm not saying that all British...
Honestly, that wasn't a stereotype I've ever heard of. Or maybe like a bit of American tourists, but not really.
British people think this way, but the ones that do, I'd be very interested to hear, do they think that way because they met an American in 1994 and they've just held on to that belief? Or are American tourists still wearing bomb bags? Do people carry cash? But I can tell you this, I don't have a bomb bag / fanny pack radar. Right? I am not constantly surveilling the populace to see whether they do or do not have a fanny pack. But my feeling is, I don't remember seeing one in a while. So I think this is one very time-specific stereotype that can now be laid to rest.
Rest in peace.
And yes, I thought I'd include one that was quite topical, not just because we are in the autumn, but also because I mentioned this fact on my YouTube short yesterday. Now, while for reasons that were laid out in that YouTube short, Americans prefer the term fall, I was surprised to find that the word autumn was pretty common among
So I've heard that the word fall is kind of like an old English word that was basically then lost in England itself. I think that's the case with quite a few quote-unquote Americanisms. Like sometimes people in the UK kind of complain about, oh, there's this new Americanism coming in, this new word for something, and it just turns out to be like an old English word that we've basically forgotten that you guys carried on using, and you're now bringing it back via American media. So yeah, it's a little ironic.
Americans. I don't know if this is a recent thing, like the whole country just woke up one morning and watched Lost in the Pond and thought to themselves, yes, we're changing things now. Or if it's just sort of always been here as an alternative to fall. And you might be thinking, ooh, Lawrence, aren't there many surprising word alternatives that Americans use that Brits don't know about? And the answer to that is yes. I merely brought this one up so I could make that very point. This is undoubtedly a pandemic era thing, but I've seen an increasing number of
don't bring it
Americans
back.
using the word jab to mean shot. I once worked with an American colleague who liked to use the word bonkers. So in part because of the internet.
I didn't realise that you guys said shot. But I mean, I have heard of getting a shot of something, and I know being shot has lots of different meanings. I've heard of getting like a shot as an injection, but I didn't realise you guys didn't say jab, which is, you know, learn something every day.
Now, just as Britain is taking on quite a few Americanisms, I think the same is true in reverse, and it will be very interesting to look further into those details. And those are just a handful of myths that some Brits believe about America and Americans. Let me know in the comments some of the myths that you've had to dispel about this country. I'm Lawrence Brown. You can follow me on Twitter at LostInThePondUS. And please subscribe to this channel and ensure to click my bell. And if you like what you see, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/LostInThePond. Until the next video, goodbye.
So that was really interesting. Of those, honestly, most of them were things I think almost all of them were things I was aware of, other than the fanny pack bum bag thing, were things I was aware of. And some of them I probably believe, or used to believe to some extent. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. It is very interesting how, like, often the stereotypes you have about a country, some of them just evaporate as soon as you actually travel to that country or meet people from that country, but some of them don't. Some of them turn out to be remarkably prescient. So it's kind of interesting to see which ones are real and which ones aren't. I mean, obviously it depends like whereabouts you go in a country and that sort of thing. But no, I found that really interesting. So please do subscribe. It really helps with the channel. Leave a like, leave a comment, leave all that good stuff. Send this to your friends, send this to your partner, send this to your tennis coach. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you.